It's Easter and the Exodus, and we're in week 5 where we're going to talk about the 4 cups. And we'll start with reading Exodus 6 through 8. Say, therefore, to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. So as we go through the 4 cups, each cup receives a blessing before we drink, and each cup gets based off of a little section of that verse in Exodus 6 through 8. And the blessing is a standard blessing for the cup of wine, which is, Blessed O you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who creates the fruit of the vine. And this blessing for the wine is very likely to be sitting in the front of Jesus' mind as he's preparing his disciples and himself to head to the cross. Since he would have just gone through this and said this blessing repeatedly as part of his Seder at the Last Supper. So when we review John 15, 1-2, and Matthew 26:39, keep this blessing of giving God the glory for the fruit of the vine in your mind. John 15, 1-2 reads, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that bears fruit, he prunes it so it may bear more fruit. And so this section in John is Jesus talking to the disciples probably as they pass by the temple on their way from the Last Supper to the Mount of Olives. And so Jesus, having said these blessings over cups of wine, has this imagery most likely right in the front of his mind when he tells his disciples that he's the vine and they are the branches, and their goal is to bear fruit.
And then in Matthew 26:39, it says, And he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And here we see Jesus as he's praying in the garden before he's taken for his crucifixion, praying to God and talking about this cup. And he would have been thinking about what is coming and the cups that he would have just taken as part of his Seder.
So number 2, the first cup is Kiddush, or the cup of sanctification. And the portion of Exodus 6 that this comes from is the section that says, I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians.
When we drink this cup, we should think about our bondage to sin and drink it in willingness to escape. How does sin burden us?
Sin corrupts our ability to enjoy God's good gifts. And as we look at this sanctification, it's talking about bringing the people out from under the burdens. And sin burdens us, and it puts us in bondage. There are many good things that are meant for us to enjoy, and living in sin, it ruins our ability to enjoy these good things. Alcohol is a prominent example in American culture, where for many generations, this gift of wine that we see as part of this festival to the Lord has been ruined for many families because of sin, and because sin has corrupted people's ability to enjoy a good thing that God meant for our good. And instead, through sin, it turned out to harm and tear apart a lot of families. And so this is just one way that we can see how it's really an enormous blessing that God wants sanctification for us, to deliver us from these bondages so that we can hopefully, to the best of our ability, enjoy all the good gifts that God has given us. So moving on to number 3 is the second cup, or where we say the Haggadah, which is the cup of deliverance. And this section reads, I will deliver you from their bondage.
Haggadah means the telling. It is the story of the Exodus.
And this section, I will deliver you from bondage, sounds almost like a repeat of the last section where it says, I'll bring you out from under their burdens. But this difference of I'm delivering you from bondage holds that implication that the Israelites weren't able to bring themselves out on their own. And it's important to see that God doesn't just steal them away in the night like they're runaway slaves that have to worry about being returned to their old master. God, through the 10 plagues, absolutely destroys the authority structure that was holding them there. The Pharaoh claimed to be a god, and he claimed to have the authority of the gods on his side. And so, as we recount the 10 plagues as part of this cup of deliverance, we see how God destroys not just our place in sin, but any authority that sin has, or any authority that Egypt had over his people.
So when we go through this at our Seder meal, what we do is we will dip our finger in our cup, the second cup of deliverance, and each plague that we say, we will take a drop from our wine glass and spill it on our placemat as we say each plague. And as we do this, we think of the plagues as symbolically reducing our joy, because when these plagues were going on, it is not something that we would rejoice over someone else's hardship and sorrow. This is something that we can feel pity and pain for anybody who has to suffer the results of their sin. And so symbolically, we are reducing our cup of joy as we are doing a drop for each plague.
And so the 10 plagues are blood, frogs, lice or gnats, swarms. Now in this, there's a couple of traditions, but the word literally translates as swarms, so that's what we'll have you put in the blank. 5, pestilence, boils, hail, locust, darkness, and death of the firstborn. And it's important to see that each of these plagues were an affront to the Egyptian theological structure of gods that were supposed to protect the natural order. In Exodus 12:12, we see God stating that he is against Egypt's gods. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. And so God's plan was to execute judgments against the Egyptian gods, not specifically against Egypt's people.
So as we look at these different plagues, we can identify several different Egyptian gods that would have been the target of these plagues. So when we go back to our worksheet here at the bottom of number 3, we see that every day the Hebrews did not leave Egypt. It hurt both God's people and Pharaoh's people. It hurt God's people because they were still in slavery, but it also hurt Pharaoh's people because of these plagues that were upon them.
And we move on to number 4, which is the third cup, the cup of redemption. And this section of Exodus 6 reads, I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments.
So there are 3 traditions that are all facets of the same thing. So these are Pesach, which is Passover, the Last Supper, and communion.
So we see, do this in remembrance of me, is a quote from Jesus in Luke 22. And this is something he says at the Last Supper, and something that is repeated traditionally when taking communion. And that's because the Last Supper is the model for communion, and the Last Supper was a Passover meal. And so when he says, do this in remembrance of me, it's the bread and the wine. And so it's a specific bit of bread, the afikomen, and a specific cup of wine, which is this third cup, the cup of redemption.
So on that last question, this was an open-ended thing. And how often should we take communion?
As we were putting materials together for this study, this is a question that I really went through a cycle of struggling through. After all, when Jesus says, "Do this in remembrance of me," he's talking about an element of a Passover meal, and the Passover is celebrated once a year. So are we in some way trivializing this when we do it weekly or if we do it monthly? Because there's a lot of different church traditions about how we take communion. And the place I wound up at is ultimately back to what we taught in the first week, that our traditions commemorate, they don't recreate. And so while the "do this in remembrance of me" is of a element of a Passover meal, the important part is the remembrance of him. And Jesus has told us, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in his name, there he is. And so as long as we are faithful in our hearts to remember him and think of his body, his blood, and God's grand plan for salvation that was laid out and symbolized all the way from this exodus of Egypt, I think we're doing just fine as far as honoring God with our tradition.
Number 5, we are at the 4th cup. Now this is where we would have the Hallel. And this cup is called the cup of praise. And that is where Hallel comes from. This is where the word hallelujah comes from. And this portion of Exodus 6 is, "I will take you for my people."
Now, the statement, "I will take you for my people," is an important one. We've turned a corner of, instead of just getting them away from Egypt and getting them out from under Pharaoh's power, with this cup, it's a change in identity. It's no longer about escaping sin. All of the sin has been handled. All of the judgment is passed. And now we see a new identity emerging. In Matthew 26:29, Jesus says, "I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom." And so we know at the very least that Jesus did not drink this cup of praise physically with his disciples. He left it full and on the table because he's waiting to drink it with us when we enter the new heavens and new earth. And one of our members of the group had astutely pointed out that he says, "When I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom," that he's not going to be drinking the same wine of the same covenants that we've had, but this is a new wine where we will have our new identity in him, where the church will finally be recognized fully as the bride of Christ at the wedding feast.
So our homework from the previous week to this was to look for songs that are in the spirit of Hallel, which is the Psalm 113 through 118. And so some of the songs that we came up with, there is the one that you know from childhood. "This is the day that the Lord has made." This is from Psalm 118, verse 24. "He knows my name. I have a maker." Comes from Psalm 116, verse 1 and 2. "Not to Us" is from Psalm 115:1. So as you look, you can enjoy looking around and finding more songs that kind of fit this whole section of Scripture. And we're hoping to use this as part of our own Seder meal, that we will sing some of these because they are songs that we know as Christians, and they are coming right out of these same psalms that Jesus would have sung as he was on his way to the cross.
We see that Jesus will bring all glory and praise to God when we enter his Father's kingdom. And this mirrors ancient Hebrew wedding traditions. The wedding feasts were bookended with cups because it was a combination religious and then cultural celebration. And to begin the religious celebration, they would take a cup and they would recite that same blessing that we saw with the Kiddush, and they would go through and do a ceremony, and at the end they would drink a second cup, which signified that the religious portion, this covenant portion, had concluded and is completed, and then the rest of the week of wedding celebration would commence after that. So when we look back in the book of John, the first documented miracle Jesus performs is the turning of water to wine at the wedding of Cana. And we tend to think of them running out of wine at this wedding like it would be an embarrassment. And while it would be embarrassing, it's more than that, because they wouldn't have the wine for this second cup. They wouldn't be able to symbolically say that they have closed their wedding ceremony and they are moving into new life together. It would be akin to forgetting the rings to a Western style wedding. It's a big deal, and it's more than just embarrassing. It's the kind of thing that you would begin to go, should we call this off and try again later? And so we see Jesus at the beginning of his ministry supplying the wine so that they can complete their wedding vows and move into new life together. And we see him mirroring this. It's a cycle that completes at the end of the book of John, where Jesus fills up our cup of redemption with his own blood, and he has a final cup prepared for us in the new kingdom. And we find ourselves exactly in the place where Mary was at the wedding of Cana, where she comes to Jesus and says, "They're out of wine, will you do something?" And he tells her, "My time has not yet come." And we, just like Mary, are waiting expectantly, knowing that he's going to fill that cup up, and we're waiting for his time to come.
Now, number 6, we come to the 5th cup. Now, this is confusing because we said this was about the 4 cups. But this is an additional custom that the Jews do, and this is called the cup of Elijah. This comes from Exodus 6, verse 8, and it says, "I will bring you to the land." Followers of Judaism believe this alludes to the coming of the Messiah, which will be announced by Elijah. They do not drink this cup because they do not yet recognize their Messiah. When they set this cup out, it is filled at their table and nobody drinks of it. But then they also will send the children to go to the door at a certain part of their Seder towards the end and see if Elijah is waiting at the door. They see Elijah as somebody who would have the authority and the blessing of God to announce the coming of a Messiah. So they wait for him before they see their Messiah. Now, we had this figure, and this was John the Baptist, who was coming, baptizing and preparing people for Jesus to come as our Messiah.
In our Seder, we will not have this cup because we're not waiting for a Messiah to come. Our Messiah has come. We've also steered away from having this cup because while we are waiting for our Messiah to return, we aren't waiting passively. We have an active role as the church to speed his coming, to proclaim the gospel. We have an active role, so we're not just sitting with open doors waiting for him to return. We are going out and assaulting the gates of hell, preparing in battle for that final day where he's going to come as a victor. And so in my mind, that really breaks down the parallels. Now, that's not to say that some messianic traditions where they do have this cup to call us forward to the second coming of Christ is wrong, but simply that we've chosen not to celebrate it in this fashion. And number 7, we corporately recited the Great Hallel, which is Psalm 136, which everyone who has spent any amount of time in church has heard and knows half of Psalm 136, because it's a call and response, where the response is, his love endures forever. So every line proclaims something great that God has done, and then it responds with, his love endures forever. And one of the things I wanted to point out after we had read this is there are many lines in this talking about how God had worked to overcome and conquer the enemies of Israel as they were entering the Promised Land. And with our Western ideals of how peace works, this seems really odd to us, that the idea of conquering other peoples is a sign of his love. This overcoming of these people wasn't an overnight decision. They had had 400 years while Israel was under Egypt to turn and repent, and God had waited for the cup of his wrath to fill up before he judged them. And it wasn't that the Israelites were so super special that they deserved to be the judges of these people, but rather that they happened to be the ones standing in the place to receive the blessing. And we see that God's judgment does not simply destroy like human judgment does. When us humans are wrathful and destroy something, we leave nothing but destruction in our wake. Think of Hiroshima. But when God destroys, he leaves an inheritance for someone. And so these Israelites see this destruction of the peoples in the land that were doing terrible things, and their day of judgment had come. But the result of it was an undeserved benefit for these people, not because of their righteousness, but because of God's goodness. And so God's judgment did not result in simple destruction, but rather in the creation of an inheritance that he had promised to them from centuries before.
As we go forward and look at our homework, we will ask that you search out songs that reflect the spirit of Dayenu. Now, this is a Hebrew word that means it would have been enough. This started as a response to a Christian hymn. It looks like it dates back possibly to like the 900s. And first, it was Christians looking at the history of the Jews and basically saying you were not satisfied. This was not enough for you. You never recognized God's blessings and providence on you. You weren't thankful. And so in response to that, the Jews developed this song, Dayenu, which is traditionally sung during the Seder, and it means it would have been enough. So we want you to look for songs that kind of reflect that same attitude of thankfulness and recognizing what God has done for us and that he is more than enough for us.